Remnants of the past, reminders of the struggles settlers faced as they tried to make their mark on early Utah. Many of the towns that came along would thrive for a time, only to end up in failure and abandonment. The structures that were left behind testify of and explain the history lived out by these brave people.
History is important in order to give a sense of balance to a person's life. We're always looking to the future, we're looking forward, and yet we have to have a basis, a root from where we came. And I also look at ghost towns as being a microcosm of history.
Any faint, shadowy semblance, those are the words used to describe a ghost. The same is true for ghost towns, the shadowy remains of a town's former life and activity. A lot of these towns have been left with many remains, old buildings and rubble that have a certain appeal.
One of the appeals of ghost towns is the is the sense of oldness about them, even though they may not necessarily be all that old. They're very picturesque. I think one thing that interests people about ghost towns is that they're so interesting to look at.
Each ghost town has a different story. Each one is unique, and the reasons a town fails to meet the test of time can be diverse. But all ghost towns have one thing in common. They give us an idea of how communities of the past lived, thrived, and failed in the struggle to survive. In the effort to settle the state of Utah, the area's mining industry began to take shape as well. Brigham Young and the Mormon pioneers attempted to settle as much Western territory as possible to insulate the Mormons from the rest of the nation. They wanted to be a separate people and distance themselves from the persecution they left behind in the East. They were separate as well in their philosophy of mining. Seeking out gold, silver, and other precious ores was frowned upon by the Mormons. Young's followers kept far from the get-rich-quick miners and their torrid shanty towns thrown up to capitalize on the latest prospect of gold or silver.
Brigham Young really discourages mining in Utah, and in that way Utah is unique from all of the other western states.
In Utah, the Mormon pioneers were interested in mining, but primarily mining of minerals that they needed for the development of their economy. Iron very early, and coal very early.
Prospectors moved in hurriedly and left just as quickly when mines dried up, leaving behind the shells of their short-lived communities. Frisco was such a community. High in the San Francisco mountains of Utah, the town that once was home to more than 6,000 people lies in ruin and decay. Its appearance now is very different from that of the 1880s. Two men, James Ryan and Samuel Hawk, discovered an outcropping of rich silver as they passed through this barren area in 1875. They staked their claim and started mining. After 6 successful months of mining, the two thought they should get out while the getting was still good.
Now, they really lost out because they followed the vein down and then lost it. And there was an outcropping of rock, and they didn't follow it around and lost it, sold it for $25,000. which was a lot then.
New owners believed the mine still had more to give and named her the Horn Silver Mine after the texture of the silver.
Pure silver is very malleable, and it squeezed out of the cracks and coiled. Looked like a ram's horn. That's why they called it the Horn Silver Mine.
Horn silver, now more well known than before, attracted an influx of workers, and the town of Frisco soon exploded.
Towns developed almost overnight because of the mining activity.
Miners and merchants moved in by the hundreds, erecting homes, businesses, and mining structures.
They had schools. They had a newspaper, which a lot of people don't know. It was called the Frisco Times.
As in many mining towns, most of the homes were thrown up quickly. Some of them wouldn't even deserve the name home. They were shoddy shacks of wood used for temporary shelter, as was the life of a typical miner in Frisco.
Most of those old miners, like I said, they just dug back in the sloping hill and made them a place big enough for a bed, cupboards, and a stove.
The miners typically back in those days were a rough and tumble lot. They didn't care much for amenities, and even if they were married and had wives, their wives just kind of put up with what they had there instead of beautifying it as much as possible. But you would find a lot of very rude shacks, almost sheds.
Charcoal ovens built to serve the smelters still line the old remains today.
What's unique about Frisco really is that you still have the remnants of those 5 charcoal kilns down there. Those kilns were used to make charcoal, which was used to fuel the smelters. That was before coking coal was discovered in Carbon County. Those beehive charcoal kilns were then packed with wood, allowed to smolder for various days. That's why you found little holes around the side, is because that was used to regulate the amount of air going in, because they didn't want it to burn, they wanted it to smolder. And then the charcoal was used to fuel the smelter there. "23 saloons soon found their home in Frisco, and a working man didn't have to go far to find a place where he could wash down the dust."
They had their whiskey.
Town's main problem in the early days was no water. You had a lot of the miners that used to get pretty intoxicated at night, and they said the reason for it is that alcohol costs less than the water did.
The town soon earned the reputation of the wildest town in the Great Basin. Murders were commonplace, and daily shootings became the norm.
Oh, it was very wild. He said those miners get in fights at the saloon and kill each other.
There were murders every night.
And so there were altercations quite often, especially after payday, when the miners would be paid, and there were any number of card sharks and gamesters and so forth who would draw these miners into some form of game, and through nefarious means would either rob the miners or kill them. From what I understand, there were more killings in Frisco for the size of the population and for the length of the time that it existed than any other place in Utah and possibly the Great Basin.
The trouble in town prompted the hiring of a sheriff who was to rid the town of troublemakers.
They called a Sheriff Pearson from Nevada to come in, and they were going to offer him anything they wanted. They said, "We'll build a jail, we'll build a courthouse." He said, "I don't need any of it." They said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We're going to have 3 kinds of bad guys here. We're going to have the ones that aren't going to be bad guys. We're going to have the ones that are, when I tell them to get out of town, they're going to get out of town, or I'm going to shoot them. We won't have room for a jail." And he did. Many a nights they say that he'd kill 4, 5, 6 people that were rowdy.
Many people didn't take the sheriff seriously until he killed 3 men on his first day on the job. After that, many people picked up and moved out of town. On February 12, 1885, just as the night crew emerged from the mine, disaster struck, marking the beginning of the end for Frisco.
They had a cave-in that dropped at 800 feet in.
With a thundering roar that broke windows even in Milford, 15 miles away, the sides of the deep mine gave way and the entire mine caved in from top to bottom.
They were lucky that there wasn't anybody down the mine when that happened, and lost everybody because the shaft was gone too.
Miraculously, no one was injured in the cave-in, but Frisco would never be the same. The miners were now left with no work. The mills and charcoal kilns fell silent. The population was drastically reduced. In the mine's 10-year existence, it produced more than $54 million in silver ore, but the high production days were a thing of the past. Mining did resume, however, and the few workers left in Frisco brought in $20 million more in silver ore between the years of 1885 and 1913. By 1920, no one lived in the town. Some sporadic mining continued until 1940, but the town is long dead. Most structures have been torn down or have disintegrated, but as you walk the old streets of Frisco, the ruins that remain testify of the livelihood that once occupied these hills.
One of the aspects, too, that I've been involved in a lot has been looking at the physical features that remain on the landscape to understand how they help us relate to the mining industry. You look at the buildings, you look at the sites, and you look at the way they're arranged, and you look at what's gone and what's left, and it tells you really the evolution of the mining industry, and not only the mining industry, but about the people that made the whole mining possible in the state of Utah.
The old mine stands like a silent ghost, fascinating visitors. The cemetery documents the harshness of the town. Shoddy headstones of young children remind us of the rough life experienced by those who lived in the old mining town.
Then in 1885, they say a flu epidemic that probably wouldn't have bothered us a bit went through the town.
The flu was common among the children and took several lives.
In most cases, that's what's out there, is the young people, if you look.
Now all that remains are the epitaphs to remind us of the lives once lived in this remote part of Utah.
It was a fascinating town.